not an ambush, a mine. So instead of scattering, they halted in place, packed on the road, looking for a danger under them, while the real danger sat hidden beside them. Kolobanov then fired at the rear of the column. The last tank burned. Now the road was corked at both ends. Swamp on the sides, fire at the front, fire at the rear, and a Soviet heavy tank working down the line, one target after another. The Germans eventually realized where the fire was coming from and hit back with everything they had. Shells slammed into Kolobanov's KV again and again. Inside, the crew heard it as ringing metal. Not once, not twice, more than 100 times. By the end of the engagement, the tank had reportedly been struck over 135 times without a penetration.
Imagine trying to keep loading a cannon while your whole world is being hammered from the outside. Every impact might be the one that comes through. Every clang might become fire. Every second says you should be dead already. But the armor held. Kolobanov's tank destroyed 22 German tanks in that single fight. His platoon brought the total to 43 enemy tanks destroyed across the action. The numbers sound invented until you understand the ingredients. A choke point, a hidden KV, German misreading, armor they could not penetrate, a gun that could penetrate them. It was not magic. It was geometry, timing, and steel. And this is where the story twists. Because if the KV could do this, if it could block roads and survive 135 hits and make German guns feel useless, then the obvious question is simple. Why did it not win the opening months of the war? Why did a few hundred tanks like this not drive the invaders back? The answer is ugly. The KV's deadliest enemy was not always German. It was often the KV. For everything the tank did well from the outside, it was a deeply troubled machine inside. Its transmission was a disaster waiting for a road march. The system came from an old tractor lineage and was being asked to move almost 50 tons of armor through mud, broken roads, battlefield panic, and constant strain. The gearbox fought its own driver. Gears ground, levers jammed, shifts came hard. Soviet crews passed around the kind of story that sounds too brutal to be true and too practical to be invented. A KV driver might need a hammer beside him to beat the gear lever into place. Think about that. Outside, German shells are bouncing off the armor. Inside, the driver may be wrestling the tank like it is an animal that refuses to move. The engine life was not generous either. In 1941, KV engines could wear out after roughly 80 to 200 hours of running. A long march could consume a painful part of the tank's usable life before it ever reached the battle. And the Soviet supply system was collapsing around it. Fuel did not arrive. Recovery vehicles were not available. Roads were jammed. Orders changed. Units were encircled. Mechanics had no time, no parts, and sometimes no idea where the tank was supposed to go next. So a KV might survive every German shell fired at it, and then die because its transmission seized, its engine failed, its track came off, or its fuel ran dry on a road the Red Army could no longer hold. In June of 1941, a German anti-tank crew saw something that should have been impossible. A Soviet tank was sitting in the road ahead of them, not charging, not burning, not retreating, just sitting there. They fired. The shell hit the armor clean and bounced. They fired again. Another flash, another hit, another useless spark off Soviet steel. For 2 years, German armored units had crossed Europe like a knife through paper. Poland had folded. France had fallen. British and French tanks had burned in fields and villages. German crews had learned to expect motion, panic, surrender, collapse. But this machine did not collapse. Its turret turned slowly toward the muzzle flashes. Heinz Guderian, one of the central minds behind Germany's armored warfare, pushed for a serious investigation into the Soviet tanks appearing in the East. That alone says something. When the men who built Blitzkrieg start asking how the enemy built something their guns cannot handle, the shock has reached the bones of the army. German designers studied what they were seeing. Thicker armor, better angles, wider tracks, harder hitting guns, diesel reliability, battlefield survivability. The KV was not the only Soviet machine that forced this reckoning. The T-34 had an even greater long-term influence, but the KV delivered the first brutal lesson in a very simple language. Your standard weapons are not enough. That lesson helped push Germany toward heavier, better armed, better protected tanks later in the war. The Panther, the Tiger, and a whole new obsession with armor that could both survive and kill. In that sense, the KV did more than block a road near WWII. It blocked an idea. The idea that German armored warfare had already solved the future. The Soviet factories kept trying to feed that lesson back into the war. The Kirov plant in Leningrad built KVs as the Germans drove toward the city that housed the factory itself. In 1941, production continued under worsening conditions, with the front moving closer and the siege tightening around Leningrad. Then the Soviet system did something enormous. It moved the work east. Machine tools, workers, drawings, and production knowledge were evacuated to Chelyabinsk, beyond the Ural Mountains, far from German tanks. The place would become famous as Tankograd, the tank city. The Germans could take land. They could reach the gates of Leningrad, but they could not reach every factory the Soviet Union dragged out of their path. And that mattered because the KV story is not the story of a perfect tank. It is the story of a terrifying lesson delivered by an imperfect one. It was slow. It was clumsy. Its transmission was miserable. Its engine life was short. Its crews often fought their own machine before they could fight the Germans. But on the right ground, at the right road, against the right weapons, the KV became something Germany had not planned for. A wall that shot back. A tank could be badly built and still change a battlefield. A tank could break down too often and still break an army's confidence. A tank could be abandoned in mud and still force the enemy to redesign the machines meant to kill it. So picture that road near WWII one last time. A Soviet heavy tank sitting across the supply line. German guns firing, shells striking home, and nothing happening. Not because the Germans were cowards, not because their army was weak, but because for one long day, their best system met a machine it had no normal answer for. The KV was never the best tank of the Second World War, but it was the tank that taught the best army in the world what fear sounded like when steel refused to break. And for the men watching it, the entire war changed shape, because 3 days into Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, German panzer divisions met a Soviet heavy tank their normal guns could not kill. They called it a monster. The Red Army called it the KV, and for a few terrible months in 1941, this slow, crude, unreliable giant did something almost no army in Europe had managed to do. It made the Blitzkrieg stop. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what German tank crews believed when they crossed the Soviet border on June 22, 1941. They believed they were the future. And honestly, they had reasons. Their tanks were not the heaviest in Europe. Some were not even especially powerful. But the German panzer arm was trained, coordinated, aggressive, and terrifyingly fast. Tanks moved with infantry. Artillery moved with them. Aircraft struck ahead of them. Radio coordination turned separate units into one moving weapon. By the summer of 1941, that weapon had already crushed Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and most of the confidence Europe had left. So when roughly 3,000 German tanks rolled east,
Many of their commanders expected the Red Army to break in weeks. At first, it looked like they were right. Soviet airfields were bombed before planes could leave the ground. Units lost contact with their headquarters. Whole armies were encircled. Roads filled with refugees, broken trucks, abandoned guns, and burned-out Soviet armor. From the German side, it looked like France again, only larger. But scattered across the collapsing front were a few hundred machines the Germans had not really faced before.
Not many. Around 500 kV heavy tanks were available across the Soviet forces, with some estimates pushing the number higher. They were named for Klement Voroshilov, the old Soviet marshal whose initials were bolted onto the heaviest tank the Red Army had. And the first crews to meet one in open combat did not forget the lesson. The KV was not elegant. It was a brute. It weighed about 45 to 47 tons, more than twice as much as some German tanks facing it. A Panzer III could look almost lightweight beside it. Bridges hated it. Roads suffered under it. Soft ground could swallow it if the driver chose badly. But all that weight bought one thing the Germans were not ready for: armor. The KV carried roughly 3 inches of steel across the front and turret, with heavy protection along the hull. On paper, 3 inches may not sound mythical. On a 1941 battlefield, it was close to a wall. The standard German anti-tank gun was the 37mm pack. It had worked against many Polish and French vehicles. It was light enough for crews to manhandle into position. It was supposed to be practical, mobile, reliable. Against the KV, it became a joke with wheels. German soldiers started calling it the door knocker, because firing it at a KV was almost like knocking on a locked steel door and hoping the tank opened politely. The shell hit. The armor rang. The tank kept coming. And the gun crew had just revealed exactly where it was. That was the nightmare. The shot did not stop the Soviet tank. It announced the shooter. A little flash in the trees, a puff of smoke beside a road, a crew crouched behind a shield, thinking they had done their job. Then the KV's 76.2mm gun turned toward them. The Germans tried heavier weapons. The 50mm anti-tank gun was stronger, more serious, a real step up. At normal battlefield ranges, it often failed too. To have a chance, German gunners had to let the KV come much closer than any sane man wanted. Close enough to hear the engine. Close enough to see the turret move. Close enough for the Soviet crew to make the first mistake matter. But the KV did not need a lucky angle. Its 76.2mm gun could kill any German tank on the field. Early versions carried the L-11. Later tanks mounted the F-32, then the F-34 or ZIS-5 family. The model changed, but the problem did not. German shells bounced off the KV. KV shells did not bounce off German tanks. That was the terror. It was not just protected. It was dangerous at the same time. It could stand inside the German killing zone, ignore the punishment, and answer with a gun that made panzer crews feel thin-skinned for the first time in the war. It also ran on diesel. The KV's V2K engine produced about 600 horsepower. Diesel fuel was harder to ignite than gasoline, which mattered in a war where a clean hit could turn a tank into a furnace. Even when German rounds found vulnerable spots, the KV was less likely to become the instant fireball German crews hoped for. So from the outside, the tank looked almost unfair. Thick armor, a serious gun, diesel fuel, 5 men inside. 47 tons of Soviet stubbornness. But hidden under that armor was a weakness the Germans could not see. A weakness that would destroy more KVs than their shells ever could. Not yet. First, the Germans had to meet the tank on a road in Lithuania. The place was near Raseiniai. The date was June 23, 1941, the second full day of the invasion. The German 6th Panzer Division was driving through the Baltic countryside as part of the northern thrust toward Leningrad. Speed was everything. The entire German method depended on outrunning reaction. A panzer division that kept moving could split armies apart. A panzer division that stopped became just a long line of men, vehicles, fuel trucks, and nervous supply officers. Then, one Soviet heavy tank moved into the wrong place for Germany and the perfect place for itself.
It parked across a road behind the German spearhead. On one side of that road were the forward German units. On the other side were their fuel, ammunition, food, trucks, recovery gear, and the rest of the division's lifeline. The tank did not have to destroy a division. It only had to sit where the division needed to breathe. The ground around the road was marshy. Heavy vehicles could not simply swing wide and bypass it. Leave the road, and you risked bogging down. Stay on the road, and the KV was waiting. So one tank turned a fast-moving armored division into two separated halves. The Germans brought up anti-tank guns. Several 50mm guns were pushed into firing positions, hidden near the road. Crews opened up at close range. The Soviet turret turned.
The KV destroyed the guns, one after another. The German hits had no visible effect. The Soviet return fire erased the crews sent to stop it. What should have been a clean anti-tank solution became a demonstration that the usual solution no longer worked. So the Germans reached for the gun they feared and trusted most, the 88. Originally built as an anti-aircraft weapon, the 88mm gun fired with enough force to threaten the KV's armor. It was powerful, accurate, and already developing the reputation it would carry for the rest of the war. But it was also large, hard to hide, slow to move, exposed when used on the ground. German crews began dragging one into position behind the KV, trying to strike from the rear. The Soviet crew saw it. Before the 88 could settle the problem, the KV settled the 88. One shot knocked the weapon out. That is the moment the story becomes almost absurd. The Germans had found the one battlefield gun that could kill the tank, and the tank killed it first. For the better part of a day, stretching into the next, that single KV held the road. Supplies stopped, timetables slipped. Men trained in speed were forced to wait on one disabled-looking block of Soviet steel that refused to become wreckage. A note of honesty matters here. That famous WWII vehicle is often remembered as a KV-2, the towering version with a massive 152mm howitzer turret. Some accounts, including later German writing, describe it as a KV-1. The records are mixed, but the exact model does not change the meaning. It was a KV family heavy tank with armor thick enough to make German anti-tank doctrine look suddenly old. In the end, the Germans did not defeat it with a simple duel. They used distraction. Light tanks moved in front of it, pulling the turret's attention. Another heavy gun was maneuvered into a rear firing position. This time, the rounds struck where they needed to strike. The armor was pierced. Even then, the turret reportedly kept moving, so combat engineers crawled close and finished the job with explosives through the holes already punched in the steel. A division had needed guns, decoys, engineers, and time to kill one tank. And when the Soviet crew was dead, the Germans buried them with honors near the road. Enemies do not do that because you were easy to beat. They do it because you frightened them. And WWII was not the only time the KV made German confidence look foolish. By August 1941, the drive on Leningrad was grinding toward Krasnogvardeysk, now Gatchina, a key road junction south of the city. German armored formations needed the roads. Leningrad was the prize. Momentum still mattered. In their path stood Senior Lieutenant Zinovy Kolobanov. He had 5 KV-1 tanks. 5. Against the armored spearheads of multiple German divisions. On a flat map, that is not a defense. That is a short delay before the road opens again.
Kolobanov understood the map was not the battlefield. He studied the ground. The road passed through swampy terrain, with narrow causeways and limited room to maneuver. A German column forced into that channel could not spread out.
Tanks would come nose to tail. If the front stopped and the rear stopped, everything in between would be trapped. Kolobanov placed his KVs to cover the approaches. His own tank waited hull down near the kill zone, hidden enough that only what needed to show was showing. Then he waited. That waiting may have been the hardest part. German tanks approached. Closer, then closer. A commander in ambush has to let the enemy enter the trap before closing it. Fire too soon, and the column scatters. Fire too late, and the moment can pass forever. Kolobanov held. Then his gunner, Andrei Yusov, fired on the lead tank. It burned and stopped. And here the German column made the mistake that doomed it. They thought the lead tank had hit a mine. That was the bitter contradiction. The tank Germany struggled to kill was often abandoned by the army that needed it most. Crews destroyed their own vehicles when they could not recover them. Others were left by the roadside as the front moved past. A 47-ton fortress became useless the moment it could not move. The armor could defeat the enemy. It could not defeat a bad gearbox. Still, the KV mattered far beyond the machines that broke down. It changed what the Germans believed they were fighting. Reports of the KV and the T-34 moved up through German command and landed like bad news at the top. German officers who had expected backward Soviet armor were suddenly reading accounts of tanks with thick armor, powerful guns, diesel engines, and wide tracks that handled mud better than many German vehicles.